Did y'all get a box of matches? Okay, don't light them. Okay, I checked. We're not insured for arson, right? If the church burns down because somebody else lit it on fire, our insurance covers it. But if you light it on fire, not so much. So we're going to talk about fire today. And I want to start with an actual question from the University of Washington chemistry midterm. It's a bonus question for a test. Is hell exothermic, gives off heat, or endothermic, absorbs heat? Most of the students wrote answers using proofs from Boyle's law, which says that gas cools off when it expands and heats up when it's compressed. With me so far? Not so much, right? One student, however, wrote this. First, we need to know how the mass of hell is changing in time, so we need to know the rate at which souls are moving into hell and the rate at which they are leaving. I think we can safely assume that once a soul gets to hell, it will not leave. Therefore, no souls are leaving. Theologically, I question that. As for how many souls are entering hell, we can look at the world's religions and note that many of them state that if you are not a member of their religion, you will go to hell. And since there is more than one of these religions and folks do not belong to more than one religion, we can safely project that all souls go to hell. Thus, we conclude that the number of souls in hell will continue to increase exponentially. Boyle's law states that in order for the temperature and pressure in hell to stay the same, the volume of hell has to expand proportionately as souls are added. We need more space for more souls. This gives us two possibilities. Stick with me here. One, if hell is expanding at a slower rate than the rate at which souls enter hell, then the temperature and pressure in hell will increase until all hell breaks loose. Or, if hell is expanding at a rate faster than the increase of souls in hell, then the temperature and pressure will drop until hell freezes over. So which is it? Well, writes the student, if we accept the postulate given to me by Teresa in my freshman year that it will be a cold day in hell before I sleep with you, and take into account the fact that I have still not succeeded in having sexual relationships with Teresa, then number two cannot be true, and thus I am sure that hell is exothermic and will not freeze. And he got the only A in the class. Today, I want to remind us that as amusing as this is, there's a painful core of truth to it, and it's not what you think. The painful core of truth is that we think there's a hell somewhere. We think there's a hell somewhere that collects souls. In matters of the spirit, there is no time and space. This is a spiritual matter. So the whole question of whether hell is getting bigger or smaller, or you're going to get sent there, which implies there's someplace to go, that whole question is moot. You know, even in high school, I found some religious ideas kind of suspect. And you probably think a high schooler thinking about religious ideas is a little suspect, and you'd be right. For example, if God makes every human with a different set of fingerprints, then why would God make only one way to find God? Also, while I've always been a church girl, there's no explaining it, I was always uncomfortable with preachers that seemed to feel a need to scare people into buying our product. Our product is Jesus and salvation, and the need to thoroughly scare people struck me as like one of those television advertisements for home security, you know, where first they show you the husband leaving and the wife locks the door, but out on the sidewalk is a hooded guy tying up his sneakers, watching everything, and then he kicks in the door, and luckily they have whatever security system is being sold, and she gets saved. Now, apart from all the sexism rampant in that, even at 16, I couldn't buy that that's how heaven and hell work. You know, what we used to do is tell people how bad they were so that they would be grateful God loves them. We used to tell them how bad they were and that they didn't deserve God's love, but lucky for them, God loves them anyway. What I think we do now here is remember each week that we are all broken people in need of healing and grace and the knowledge that our picture is on God's refrigerator. We don't need to threaten people with hell, do we? There's quite enough hell available for us in this life. This week I want to spend just a few minutes reimagining some of our personal spirituality ideas. And next week we'll spend a little time considering how churches work. You know, how the church could, how it used to, and how it now can work to be a spiritual community. And I want to say that when it comes to our personal, individual spirituality, there are two kinds of people. And by the way, you shouldn't listen to people who say there are only two kinds of people. But for today, just listen to me. The truly spiritual people pray all the time. The only book they read is the Bible. They never swear. They never lie. They don't even steal pencils from work. They're just too good to be true. Now, the not very spiritual ones are the ones who spend too much time at parties, drinking wine with the kinds of people their mother told them to avoid. Which one of these people looks like they're having more delight in life than the other? Honestly, which one looks more like Jesus? Can it really be that hard to let go of some of our old ideas about being spiritual that we got from we don't even know where anymore? You know, we spend, I think, already, most of us, too much time feeling that our spiritual practices, our spiritual life, our spiritual identity is inadequate. Somebody else somewhere, or maybe everybody else everywhere, is more spiritual than us. Over the years, a lot of people come to me, and I find that they think they're doing something wrong in their spiritual life, mostly because their personal temperament doesn't seem to match what somebody told them spirituality was really about. If you're an introvert, then all the talk of silence, quiet time in the morning, reading, meditation sounds like heaven to you. If you're an extrovert, not so much. That might be exothermic. About 15 years ago, I began working with a spiritual director. Maybe it's longer than that now. Yeah, I think it might be. And we'd been working together for about 6 months, and she suggested that I might enjoy an 8-day silent retreat that had been meaningful for her. And I said, "Have you met me?" So today I want to ask you this. What lights your fire? What lights your fire? What makes your heart sing? What makes your throat tighten up and your eyes pool? What makes you dance and whistle a tune? What gives you peace? The Reverend Susan Roth tells this great story. I was leading a retreat for people, she says, who were interested in learning new spiritual exercises. And I had just sent the group off in a season of silence to listen to what God might be saying to them. And the leader of the group wandered over to me and started talking. And the longer he talked, the more uncomfortable I became. Finally, she writes, I told him I was uneasy about having a conversation while the rest of the group has been asked to go be silent. And he said, yes, but I'm an extrovert. I need to talk and listen to people to hear God. I don't hear God in silence. I don't hear God in silence. I want to make a plea, he told her, for extroverts. Don't forget that some of us find God in people and activity rather than going off to be silent. And some of us need all of that. We need the whole thing, some of each. You know, maybe just maybe, there's more than one way for you to catch fire. If God made you with a unique set of fingerprints, then why would there only be a dozen or half a dozen or 2 or 16 ways for God's grace to be a part of your life and light you on fire? So Acts 2 isn't the only place we can learn about how people catch fire. This is from Matthew 14, beginning in the 22nd verse. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. And in Matthew, that does mean the 12. And go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. Now, he has just fed 5,000 people or 4,000 or, a lot. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. Not too hard to understand that after dealing with the needs of 5,000 people, and we have to assume they needed more than just food, they needed, a spiritual feeding as well, he was tired. And when evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, that the disciples are in the boat, Jesus is on the mountain, battered by the waves, far from the land, and the wind is against them. And early in the morning, Jesus comes walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it's me, don't be afraid." And Peter said, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus says, "Come." Peter gets out, and you know what happens next. Peter starts walking on the water, but he notices the strong wind. The storms of life are raging. He becomes frightened, he begins to sink, and he cries out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, which is great, and says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Which is not so great. When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, there's a lot in here. There's the calming of the storm. There's the Jesus walking on the water. There's the Peter's failure. But I want to suggest that what we have here is a lesson in spirituality, in how to be a spiritual person. Jesus was looking for a deserted place. Jesus needs time with people to share, but he also needs time alone to restore himself. He needs rest and solitude. Gathered people that Jesus had just been with seemed to need a crowd. Some people would look at a crowd of 5,000 and say, "Whoa, something good's going on around here. We want to be a part of this," and they'll shove their way to the front. Other people look at a crowd of 5,000 and they say, "I don't know what's going on here, but I'm going the other way." Right? We are all different. The disciples seem to need spiritual strengthening that comes from serving others, because the lesson right before this is in how the disciples can help feed people. And they need to be reminded of what gifts they have. And once again, in the boat, Jesus seems to need solitude and seems to think the disciples at least need a little of that too to restore their trust in him. And then he realizes they need him to be there with them, and they also need his presence when they are in fear. And Peter apparently needs an absolutely miraculous mystical experience to learn how to trust Jesus. Nowhere, here or anywhere else, do we hear Jesus giving out directions for how to be spiritual, what kinds of spiritual disciplines are required, what a truly spiritual person looks like. Jesus just points to the children and the prostitutes as good examples. Children and prostitutes, in Jesus' experience, are the people who chase after spiritual grace like their life depended on it. Consider that for a minute. Children and prostitutes are the ones Jesus finds to be deeply spiritual. So you should be okay. After about 3 years of working with my spiritual director, I finally took her suggestion and registered for that 8-day silent retreat. Turns out, luckily, it wasn't completely silent. Each day there was a little time before dinner where we shared our experiences, and each day we had a chance to spend an hour with a spiritual director. And it was only as lonely as you wanted it to be, because there was a living room where you could sit, there was a dining room where there were some art projects, or you could take a walk in the woods. You know, most of the day was spent in silence, but not necessarily aloneness, unless that was what you needed and wanted. And it was a revelation to me. I had no idea how much I had been craving silence. Eventually, the voices in my head even quieted down. It brought a whole new depth to my spiritual practice, and over the ensuing 10 years, I discovered I have a deep-seated introvert's need for spiritual alone time. And I still needed people, because I'm also an extrovert. Turns out, maybe you're like this too, just a little more complicated than all of the spiritual platitudes might let us think. Some of us think we aren't really spiritual because we can't figure out what the Bible is saying to us when we are alone and reading it, because we need to be in conversation with others. How many of us have had a mystical experience as a sign of God at work? And how many of us, when some wild mystical story comes their way that somebody else had, thinks to themselves, you know, if that happened to me, I'd check with my psychiatrist and get some medication. Some folks sense God's guidance often, daily. Other people sense God's guidance occasionally, and based on their spiritual practices, make their own decisions on a day-to-day basis based on a foundation of their spiritual guidance. Some folks love an hour in this sanctuary on one of our prayer vigil days. Some folks feel closer to God when they're rolling burritos for the burrito breakfast. Some folks like to read books. Some folks like to listen to music. Some people like to walk in the woods, and some people like to have beer with friends. Every one of these can be a spiritual practice. It depends on you. I'm not saying you shouldn't also try to develop some spiritual practices that push your envelope, that stretch you a little bit, as I did with my spiritual director. There are some amazing gifts in that. All I'm trying to say on this day of fire, and next week as well, is that everyone catches fire differently. And some of us are afraid of spiritual fire. So anybody play with matches when they were a kid? Okay, I'll tell you how my parents handled that. I have a brother and a sister, so there were three of us. We're all pretty close together. And we were all messing with matches a lot. And, my parents didn't quite know what to do about that, and then I don't know which one of them thought this up, probably my mom. They bought us those large boxes of matches, they're about this big. They bought 3, and they sent us out to the patio and said, we want you to light every single one of them. Don't come in until you've lighted the whole box. Well, we weren't even halfway through the box before we got tired of it. And we said, we get it, we don't want to do this anymore. And my mom, or my dad, I don't even remember which, said, nope, you're not done. And I will tell you, I still love candles. I still love a good fireplace. I like a bonfire, but I don't care much for just lighting matches just to be lighting matches. We don't need to be afraid of fire, but we need to know that spiritual fire has a proper place in our lives. And God's call to you is the place where your deep gladness and the world's hunger meet. The place God calls you, this is where your heart lights up. It's the place where your deep gladness and the world's hunger meet. So, what are you going to do with your matches today? What are you going to do with the potential that's right there in your hand right now? Maybe you'll light up a pilot light and cook something good for the family. Maybe you'll light a candle for hope. or comfort or quiet. Maybe you'll light the sterno under the burrito breakfast stuff. Maybe you'll light a bonfire that can be seen for miles and miles and miles and draw people to its warmth. There's an old story, and I've probably told it to you before, but it's a good story. Young priest in London got visited by the archbishop to see how he was doing in his new pastorate. And the young guy says, "Oh, Archbishop, you know, it's really hard. This work is hard. And I got to tell you, I don't think I'm setting the Thames on fire. I don't think I'm setting the Thames River in London on fire." And the Archbishop said, "I don't need you to set the Thames River on fire. What I want to know is if I pick you up and throw you in that river, will you sizzle?" So may it be for you today, for us today, and in the days ahead, alone and together. And I hope you'll join me next week when we talk about getting some new ideas, about fresh ideas about what it means to be a church together. Amen?